discussed, we also now know that the CHIP has been funded for 10 years at the federal level, and we now have the legislative funding bill signed by the governor as of Monday. All of these previous uncertainties are now reflected in this forecast, and in addition, we have included our projections of future economic growth. The budget forecast reveals the $188 million deficit from November has been replaced with a $329 million surplus. You can see that the revenues are growing by $353 million and expenditures are decreasing by $167 million. Now that's a net decrease, and Budget Director Kelly will describe that in more detail. The expenditures for fiscal year 2018-2019 now include the bill signed, as I said, on Monday by the governor for the legislative funding for this biennium. The total change, as you can see from the November forecast, is $518 million, or a $500 million improvement from what we saw in November. So I will now bring up Dr. Kalambokidis to explain the economic forecast.
Thank you, Commissioner. So I will start by talking a bit about the outlook for the U.S. economy and how that outlook has changed since we last prepared a forecast in November. I will then move to Minnesota's economy and finally the changes in our revenue forecast. So the first chart compares the current U.S. real GDP forecast by Minnesota's macroeconomic consulting firm, IHS, to their prior forecast. So the dark bars show IHS's February 2018 outlook, the one that informs our forecast today, and the light bars show their November 17 outlook. The chart shows that the outlook for U.S. economic growth has improved since the November forecast. The U.S. economic data coming in this winter has been solid. Consumer spending and business equipment investment have been strong, and consistent growth in other major economies has strengthened demand for U.S. exports. In addition to the improvements in initial conditions, earlier this year, IHS incorporated into their baseline outlook stimulus from the Federal Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the TCJA. That was not in their November forecast, so that is a change from the November forecast to now. The addition of the TCJA has modestly improved the near-term U.S. outlook, U.S. economic outlook. It has also sped up expected price and interest rate increases and significantly raised the forecast for federal deficits. In IHS's February outlook, consumer spending and business investment both contribute more to 2018-19 real GDP growth relative to November, and both of those things, consumer spending and business investment, are incentivized by the TCJA. IHS has increased their forecast for real GDP growth in 2018 to 2.7% from 2.5% in the November outlook. Real GDP is forecast to maintain that 2.7% growth in 2019 before dropping to 2.1% in 2020 and 1.9% in 2021. That deceleration from 2.7 to 2.1% is due to slower growth in both consumer spending and business investment, the things that were incentivized by the TCJA, as the impacts of the TCJA are offset by more aggressive monetary policy. The next chart shows growth in total U.S. real consumer spending, so one of the things that was responsible for the increased economic outlook. IHS expects consumer spending to remain the primary contributor to growth in the economy, even as the pace of spending eventually slows. In the short term, consumer spending is well supported by rising employment, disposable income, rising household wealth, with an additional temporary boost from lower tax rates from the TCJA. In this forecast, real consumer spending is expected to grow 2.9% in 2018 compared to the 2.5% projected in November. And that improved forecast continues into 2019 with projected growth at 2.4% relative to 2.2% in November. You will see the impact of this improvement on our sales tax forecast when I explain the revenue change. Past 2019, however, IHS does not expect consumers to keep up the pace. They forecast a slowdown in real consumer spending in the years of our planning estimates. Spending growth is forecast to decelerate, slow down, from 2.4% in 2019 to 2.1% in 20 and 21. And this occurs because IHS expects consumers to shift their focus from spending to saving. Turning now to Minnesota's economy, the first chart about Minnesota's economy shows the headline unemployment rate. So the headline unemployment rate over time, the broad unemployment rate over time. The dark line is for Minnesota and the light line is for the United States. And as usual, the vertical gray bars indicate the US recessions. So the white space between the bars represents the recovery and expansion periods. With the US expansion in the second half of its 9th year, which is a mature expansion, Minnesota's steady economic performance and tight labor market continue. The state is currently adding jobs at the same rate as the nation, even as available workers become scarce. And that steady job growth has kept the unemployment rate low. Minnesota's unemployment rate currently stands between the low points of the prior two expansions at 3.1%, nearly 1 point below last year, and a full point below the US rate, and the lowest we've seen in about 17 years. The next chart illustrates Minnesota's tight labor market. The gray bars show the number of unemployed people in the state, and so this is the number of people associated with the unemployment rate you saw in the prior chart, and so it's people who are both unemployed and looking for work, actively looking for work. So the height of the gray bars shows the number of unemployed people in the state, and the dark bars show the number of job vacancies statewide. So in the height of the gray bars, you can see the peak of the recession or the depth of the recession. And then you can see that steady job growth that I talked about. Minnesota's had steady job growth through the expansion. That steady job growth whittling that number down. The dark bars, again, show job vacancies. And as you can see from the final data points on the right, that job vacancy number has reached a very high level. And then the relationship between the two, the ratio of the number of unemployed job seekers statewide to the number of job vacancies statewide, so the relationship between the gray and the dark bar in each time period, that ratio has hovered around 1.1, 1.2 for the last 3 years. But it is now below 1. It's 0.9. So that means, so you can see the dark bar rises slightly above the gray bar. That means that there are now slightly fewer unemployed job seekers than open positions across the state. Together, high demand for labor and low unemployment have supported growth in Minnesota wage and salary income. Over the last 12 months, average hourly wages by private sector employees in Minnesota have been growing faster than the comparable rate for US workers. The large number of open positions, so the large number of vacancies in this chart, that large number of open positions improves prospects for job seekers around the state, and better prospects may have contributed to a gradual increase in Minnesota's labor force participation rate, which has ticked up to 70.6%. That's 1.3 percentage points higher than a year ago. It's the second highest among US states, and it's nearly 8 percentage points above the national rate. And the increase is notable because Minnesota already had one of the highest participation rates among states, and it was already well above the US rate, and it's occurring as the large baby boomer cohort is retiring. So these changes in the economic forecast have helped bring up our forecast for tax revenues. So that's the next slide. Total general fund revenues, as you heard from the commissioner, for the current biennium are now forecast to be $353 million more than the November forecast. Higher expected individual sales, individual income tax, sales, corporate tax, and other tax revenue all contribute to the change. So all of the major tax categories have a higher forecast now than they had in November. In addition to the improvements in the near-term economic outlook that I've already explained, this forecast reflects increased state income and corporate tax revenues expected to arise from taxpayer responses to the federal tax law changes in the TCJA. So this was a big and complicated tax law change at the federal level, and as individual and business taxpayers are trying to figure out how the new tax law affects them, they're adjusting to these changes, and they're adjusting their fares, making various choices. And some of those the choices they make will automatically affect Minnesota tax revenue under Minnesota's current law. So that's even without any legislative action, so without conformity. So these are changes that people are making in response to the federal tax law, and not just individuals, but corporations too, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And we've included a net positive change to the revenue forecast for those changes. So those estimates are included in this forecast. The largest dollar amount change in the revenue forecast is in the corporate income tax, which is forecast to generate $131 million more in FY 18-19 than we had estimated in November. The three things that have moved the corporate income tax forecast are that we have larger than expected corporate receipts so far in this fiscal year, so that raises the base for the forecast. The corporate profits forecast from IHS is a little bit higher than it was in November. And this change reflects increased state corporate tax revenues expected to arise from corporations responding to the TCJA. Specifically, the repatriation provisions in the new federal law, so corporations under the new federal law have to deem all of their foreign source income as repatriated to the United States and pay tax on it. So that deemed repatriation provision should induce firms to actually repatriate some of that foreign source income. So not just deemed repatriated, but actually bring it back. And if they do, to the extent that they do that, Minnesota will pick up some tax revenue for that. And so we have an increase in the corporate tax revenue forecast for those actual repatriations. There is a related addition to the individual income tax that's related to those repatriations that I'll explain in a moment. Consistent with the improved outlook for consumer spending that I showed you in the bar charts, the sales tax revenue forecast is also up. Sales tax revenue in FY 18-19 is now forecast to be $119 million more than the November forecast. This is due to a higher forecast for taxable sales in both 2018 and 2019. So we don't tax everything that is shown in that consumer spending bar chart that I showed you earlier. Minnesota taxes items that are included in consumer spending and some items that are included in business spending. We construct a proxy sales tax base based on the items that Minnesota does tax, and we see how that proxy base grows over time, and that's how we construct our sales tax forecast. So that proxy base is expected to grow 1.1 percentage points faster in 2018 and 1.6 percentage points faster in 2019 than we had assumed in November. Moving to individual income tax receipts, this forecast in the current biennium is now up $25 million relative to what we had in November. This relatively small change is the sum of offsetting effects. So some changes that were made raised the forecast relative to November, and some of them lowered it. So that's why the number looks smaller than some might expect. It's one of the reasons. For example, we now know that tax liability for tax year 2016, the base year of our forecast, so we start with a base year and grow from there. The tax liability for 2016 we now know is lower than what we had estimated in November. So that brings down the income tax forecast overall. We also had in the first 3 quarters of 2017 low estimated tax payments, which are prepayments taxpayers make on current liability, and it's generally taxpayers who have non-wage income. So having lower than expected estimated payments for that period means that our forecast for non-wage income, capital gains, dividends, business income, that those kinds of things were too high. And so we've lowered our forecast for some forms of non-wage income, and that brought the forecast down relative to what it would have been. On the other hand, looking at some of the changes that moved things in the other direction, taxpayer responses to the TCJA are estimated to raise individual income tax revenue on net relative to our November forecast. For example, those corporations who have to deem repatriated all of their foreign source income, once they have that income repatriated and they pay tax on it, they can do what they want with it. And we expect that a large portion of the money that is repatriated under the TCJA will be paid out in additional dividends and stock buybacks. And so that additional financial income, some of that is going to flow through to Minnesota taxpayers, and it's going to flow through to our individual income tax. So increased financial income for some of those taxpayers raises the forecast for the individual income tax. Let me conclude by drawing your attention, and let me be clear that that's what I meant by That's the other side of the corporate change. So on the corporate side, we directly raised revenue because of the actual repatriations. On the individual side, we indirectly have an impact because some of that foreign source income that is deemed repatriated gets paid to individuals. So let me turn to my final slide, and I'll conclude by drawing your attention to some of the risks in this forecast. First, the TCJA made some big changes to federal tax law, and individuals and business owners are still figuring out how that new law affects them. Uncertainty remains about how people will respond to the changes and the impacts on both the economy and on state tax revenues. And again, those changes that we've incorporated here are before any changes to Minnesota current law. In this forecast, inflation is projected to gradually rise from what have been in the past very low rates, in the recent past very low rates, and the Fed is expected to continue to move interest rates higher. However, employing fiscal stimulus, such as the tax cuts in the TCJA and the proposed $300 billion additional federal spending in the federal budget agreement, this late in the business cycle, when the U.S. labor market is near full employment or possibly at full employment, could cause prices to accelerate more quickly and the Fed to act more aggressively than is assumed in this forecast. So some Fed action is included in this forecast, but if prices rise faster than what's expected in this forecast, then interest rates are likely to rise faster as well, and the economy will slow down. So those actions could cause the economy to grow more slowly than is assumed here. The current environment of consistent global growth, where no major economy is currently in a recession, is welcome for Minnesota's exporting sectors, including agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. But geopolitical events and possible U.S. trade policy changes, including changes to NAFTA and to other trade treaties, could threaten that climate and reduce overseas demand for the state's products. Finally, with 16 months remaining in FY 18-19, we've seen less than 30% of the total revenues we've forecast for this biennium. Even small changes to assumed growth rates in particularly volatile income sources, such as capital gains and corporate profits, could materially alter the budget picture for this biennium and the next. I'll now turn it over to Budget Director Kelly.
Thank you, Dr. Kalambokidis. I'm going to walk through the expenditure changes in this forecast for this biennium and then talk about structural balance over the forecast time horizon. If you look on the table here, you see in the lower right that overall spending is lowered in the current biennium compared to the previous forecast by $167 million. There are four main changes to discuss in this expenditure forecast. The first change is education spending. Overall, it's down by $54 million from our November forecast, which is just a 0.3% change on a $19 billion budget. So last forecast, we saw spending on special education services by school districts. We saw that it had been increasing at a faster rate than we had expected, and we adjusted our forecast upward. We now know that actual spending for the academic year 2016-17 is a little bit lower than we had thought, and we are now adjusting our forecast accordingly. So we have lowered our expenditures on special education downward, and that's most of what the $54 million savings in education is from. The second main change is the Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP, in the Health and Human Services line on the table here. You see that Health and Human Services spending is lowered by $254 million compared to last forecast. That's about a 2% change on a $14 billion budget. So absent a federal appropriation for the program last November, we assumed the cost for CHIP would fall 100% on the state budget, and we added $178 million of increased spending to our forecast. We now know that CHIP is funded through 2027, and our allotment for the current biennium is higher than earlier estimates as well. So $225 million of the Health and Human Services savings is due to federal appropriations for CHIP. The third big major change in this forecast is on the all other line of spending. On Monday, the governor signed into law the legislative appropriations bill, adding $114 million of spending in the current biennium. That increase in spending offsets the savings that everyone was anticipating in this forecast. The fourth major change is also in the all other line of spending. When the budget was adopted last session, we shifted $22 million of spending that had traditionally been out of the general fund onto the Clean Water Fund. And we enacted a provision that if there was a positive balance in a forecast, we would move general fund money into the Clean Water Fund behind it. And so that provision is triggered with this forecast. Now that we have a positive balance, we have enacted that transfer into law, effectuated that transfer, and increased spending by $22 million as well. So if we move on to the next slide, looking ahead to the 2021 biennium, this table here speaks to our structural balance. It compares the revenues collected within the biennium to the current law spending obligations in the same biennium. Last November, we were projecting a negative balance out into the future, and with this forecast, we now have positive structural balance in the 2021 biennium. We have average annual growth in revenues of 3.7% compared to 2.2% for expenditures. And a note there on this table, just a reminder that inflation is not in the spending forecast, but it does put pressure on our budget, and the estimates for inflation are higher in this forecast, rising to 2.8%. And with that, I will turn it back to Commissioner Frans.
Thank you, Budget Director Kelly. Well, let me just make a few comments and we'll open it up for questions. As you know, we're in the final year of the Governor Dayton's administration, and we share the governor's goal of delivering a balanced budget to whomever assumes the title of governor next year. The principles of sound fiscal management have guided Governor Dayton's time in office, and in order for us to deliver a balanced budget to the next administration, we must be prudent during this legislative session. While a $329 million surplus is not a small figure, in actuality, it comprises less than 1% of the state's total budget. And the balance on the bottom line for 2020 and 2021 is even smaller. I know a question will be asked today about how much money we need to leave on the bottom line after this session. The truth is there's no magic number. I will say it's important to keep track of each proposal's impact both on this biennium and the next biennium. Spending and revenue changes, as we have seen, can grow over time, and our projections for the next 2 to 4 years in the future are always subject to changes. I would say that our current forecast for the 2020 biennium does not provide much of a buffer against future forecast changes. This chart demonstrates that we have a balanced budget for 2021, and we see revenues growing faster than expenditures, but it also shows the inflation pressures that we will experience in the future. As the state's chief financial officer, I want to ensure the stability of state finances now and into the future. The fact is, Minnesota's economy is in a great place. We are fortunate to be home to such a talented workforce, a diverse economy, and a business community that invests back into our great state. As a result, Minnesota has low unemployment and a growing economy. We are also in one of the longest economic expansions in U.S. history, however, and that's something we need to take very seriously. With this forecast, Minnesota's budget is back on track. We should not take a positive balance for granted, though. We must proceed with caution, and we must work together to ensure that the next administration does not inherit the same $6 billion deficit that Governor Dayton faced in January of 2011. So we must continue our commitment to sound fiscal management. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
It sounded like in your closing comments there that you're kind of warning lawmakers not to spend this.
Yes. You know, it's always a delicate balance. In particular, this is always a unique situation where we're in the 1 year left to go in the biennium. So if we spend money for fiscal year 2019 for a program, you have to remember you have to double that for 20 and 21 generally, or sometimes even more than that. So the key really, I think, is for us to really focus on what are those things in this session that we really have to get done and we have the resources to do. I mean, I have my pet list, and the governor will come out a little bit later on and tell you what some of his priorities are. He will be looking over this budget forecast. We went through it with him this morning. And over the next several weeks, he will be putting together his response, both in terms of a tax conformity bill package and also a budget package to recommend what we should invest in during the next session. So that'll come out in mid-March. But it's always a delicate balance. And, you know, there's always the desire, certainly For me, I'd like to see the budget reserve filled all the way up. We're at $1.6 billion right now. We have a target of $2 billion. As some of you know, every November we put 33% of any forecast balance into that reserve, so that if we have a balance in November, that will help with that. But there obviously are needs, and I think that is the difficult balance that the governor and the legislature have to work out. What are those specific needs that rise to the level of investing the resources, the modest resources we have? So it is a challenge, and I will always be cautious when it comes to spending money.
So, Commissioner, is that a recipe for one-time spending versus any ongoing commitments?
Well, that's a great question. We faced that several years ago where we had a biennium in the future that had less money than the current biennium. And many of you will remember that was a big discussion about one-time money. So we will be talking about one-time spending. But for example, there's $251 million now as a positive balance we project for 2021. Well, if you just project $125 million of spending now and then doubling that in 20 and 21, that pretty much takes care of all of it. That leaves a little over $200 million. Well, how much of that should we leave on the bottom line, and how much of that should be one-time spending? So those kind of questions about, looking to 20 and 21, what kind of balance can we leave, what kind of one-time spending can we do, I think are critical components that this legislature and the governor are going to have to wrestle with.
Can you comment a bit more about the gap between the inflationary projection for 2021 and the structural balance that it shows? This potentially, if we were still forecasting the way we used to, would be showing a deficit and a pretty good sized one in 2021. Because we don't count inflation on the spending side, it's showing something positive. But how should legislators understand that?
The budget spending forecast carries about 25% of the spending forecast has forecasted inflation in it, but the rest of it does not, about 75%. So I think in addition to the fact that we have a modest balance for 2021, we have to take into the fact that for every dollar you spend, there's a couple dollars out there of inflation that are going to try to influence that. So I think they need to be very mindful not only of leaving a balance for the next administration, leaving some money for the reserve to build up, but also making sure that we don't put such inflationary pressures on agencies, because we're going to see inflation is growing a little bit faster than it has in the past. So these inflationary pressures are real.
So the Republican leadership is saying that this is all about tax cuts. Tax cuts work. Are they right?
Well, I'm going to have Dr. Kalambokidis come up in just a moment and explain how she factored that into her forecast. But I think the key is at the federal level, you have to remember that you can create tax cuts with deficit spending. So remember, the tax bill at the federal level costs $1.5 trillion in additional debt. And so there is a short-term benefit. The near-term benefit does create some stimulus, what Dr. Kalambokidis calls near-term stimulus. So I think the key is that at the federal level, you can do that. But at the state level, we just don't have that flexibility, because if we want to cut taxes, we either have to if we want to cut taxes for one group to stimulate the economy, we have to raise it for somebody else, or cut spending. And both cutting spending and raising taxes on other groups also have effects on the economic recovery. So this whole issue about the federal tax stimulus is really focused at the national level. We've got those numbers from IHS, our consultants, to explain how this is going to affect the national economy. But we have to step back and look at Minnesota from a different perspective with a balanced budget requirement.
Speaking of that, how much of the changes are really due to the federal policy on the CHIP and the tax bill versus state changes?
Well, that's a good question. As we mentioned last November, we were wondering about CHIP. That question was answered. It turns out it was a pretty big shift. We were wondering about the tax bill, and that's had some major impacts. So there are some major impacts from the short-term major impacts from the federal tax bill, but there are also some economic increases that Dr. Kalambokidis talked about as well. So it's a combination of both.
One of the big topics for this legislature is both tax conformity and protecting taxpayers from expected tax increases if strict conformity is followed. What risk do you see in that to a structural balance both in this biennium and the following?
Well, the other thing that the governor will, as I think I mentioned, will come out with a tax conformity bill. It's a really complicated issue this year. I mean, I think for the people like me who were around in 1986, that Tax Reform Act was a little bit different. It took longer to develop. It was more of a tax reform measure, and that's when we started conforming Minnesota taxes to the federal taxes in 1986, after that in 87. So this particular tax bill is extremely complicated. As Dr. Kalambokidis mentioned, many taxpayers, businesses, and individuals are still trying to figure out what are they going to do. So from our point of view, I mean, the governor will be looking at this tax conformity for Minnesota from a couple different perspectives. One of those is if we do nothing, if we do absolutely nothing in Minnesota, we are all going to collectively have more to do to fill out our taxes in 2019, because remember, our tax return in Minnesota starts on line 43 of the federal return. We accept federal taxable income as the beginning point. Well, there are 43 lines that happen before you get to that point, and we would have to have some sort of way to walk taxpayers from that through those 43 lines to get to the new federal taxable income, because if we don't conform, there'll be a lot of changes that we'll have to make. Well, that would be extremely complicated, and it will take a lot of time. So doing nothing causes complications. It does generally raise revenue for the state of Minnesota, because as you remember, at the federal level, the general philosophy was to broaden the tax base and reduce the rates. So what happens when it flows through to Minnesota is the tax base has been broadened, but the rates haven't been lowered if there's no change in Minnesota. So the idea of doing nothing would be difficult for taxpayers, but it would bring in more revenue for the state. And the idea of full conformity also perhaps costs the state in the sense that it would cause a lot of people to pay taxes differently than they would with a thoughtful conformity piece. I think the governor wants to take a look at ways to make sure that the Minnesota tax system remains really fair to the middle and lower income people, and also is fair, across the state. So it is one of the most difficult challenges I think the legislature and the governor have to do this session, is come together on a tax conformity bill that makes sense for Minnesota and also makes sense for our budget. You can see that if we want to spend on other items beyond the money here, that you're going to have to generate some money from some other source.
You see the variety of numbers concerning how much full conformity will have and how much additional revenue that is possible. What is the latest number?
Do you have that info? We'll get that. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact number. What you're saying what full conformity brings? Yeah. I don't have that with me right now, but it's a lot of money.
Commissioner, let me follow up on Kevin's question directly to Republicans' claims that tax cuts last year here in the state are responsible for the surplus that we're having now.
Yeah, listen, Dr. Kalambokidis.
Can you restate your question?
Yeah, Republican leadership is already saying that their tax cuts that were passed here last year are responsible for the surplus that we're seeing now. As the economist, what's your take on that?
So the impact on revenues of the economic forecast has been fed through the individual income tax and the corporate and sales tax, as you saw. And I can't identify any particular impact from Minnesota's tax action. I can say that due to the changed U.S. forecast, that we changed our forecast for wages, and as you saw, the most straightforward way to look at it is with consumer spending. And so those are the things that affected the forecast, and then we had the additional increases from taxpayer behavior changes due to the federal tax cuts.
Are you saying you can't see any state tax cut impact, or you don't know what it is?
I'm saying I can't separately identify any impact, that impact from everything else that's going on in the economy.
Can you tell us what the forecast spending is based on in the out years? It looks like you're spending trending down.
Yeah, so the question is about the economic forecast for U.S. real consumer spending that is higher relative to the November forecast in both 18 and 19, but then it decelerates and it goes down to a lower growth rate. So it's not a fall in spending, it's lower growth in spending, or slower growth in spending. And that's because, throughout this economic expansion, the consumers have been the champion of this expansion. Consumers have been responsible for most of the growth in GDP. And IHS is anticipating that consumers are just not going to keep up that pace, and that they are going to, instead, they're going to start saving some of those tax cuts that they're getting rather than spending all of those tax cuts. And so it's a change in saving behavior.
What impact would what impact would have if NAFTA would go away, for instance? Is that a major impact on the state economy?
So the question is about NAFTA and U.S. trade policy. So the U.S. trade policy has important impacts, particularly NAFTA, for Minnesota, because our primary customers are Canada and Mexico. And so the farmers in Minnesota are looking to what's happening there. The manufacturers in Minnesota are looking to what's happening there. And so that is a risk in our forecast, is that if trade policy significantly changes in a way that it reduces demand for Minnesota exported goods, then that would be, that's a downside risk for Minnesota.
Do you have a dollar figure? Is it going to be $100 million impact, $1 billion, nothing?
No, I don't have a dollar figure for that.
Is it significant? Would you call it significant?
If significant changes to NAFTA, including losing it, would create significant impact in Minnesota.
The two sources of repatriated income and corporate taxes, between both
individual and corporate taxes,
what's the total net gain to the state that you're assuming in this forecast?
This is a question about the revenue impacts under current law of changes that corporations are changing behavior by corporations due to responding to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. In the current biennium, I believe the sum total, including the direct effect on the corporate income tax and the indirect effect on the individual income tax, was about $160 million. Positive.
Just in this biennium, correct?
That's just in this biennium. There's an additional estimate in the next biennium, but I don't have it on today.
Dr. Kalambokidis, you said, I think today, that our Minnesota economy is growing apace with the national economy. I believe it was the case that in previous forecasts we talked about a lag in Minnesota growth and traced that to what was going on with our tightening labor market. What's changed in that regard, and what's your forecast looking forward about the impact of that tightening labor market on Minnesota's pace of economic growth?
Yeah, and so the specific pace that I mentioned where we're keeping up with the U.S. is in employment growth, so adding jobs to the economy, and you don't get to count a job as employment growth unless there's somebody in the job. So it's not just job vacancies, but it's actually putting somebody in that job. And over the last year, we've been growing about the same rate as, adding jobs about the same rate as the U.S. We have in the past expected employment growth to be limited by labor force growth, and consequently to have our employment growth be a little bit lower than the United States. But one thing that changed, and it changed in the middle of last year, was this uptick in the labor force participation rate, which it was very, as I mentioned earlier, it was very high. It was higher than the U.S. It was higher than other states. It's not high relative to Minnesota's history, but it's come down as the population has aged. But it is high relative to other states. And so I think that the tight labor market, we have in the forecast that more of our wage growth going forward, our total wage growth, is going to be due to increase in wages per worker rather than increase in employment. So total wage growth can grow if we have more people working or if the people working are making more money per person. So going forward, more of our wage growth is going to be driven by wages per worker. So that's that tight labor market. It's tight supply, increased demand, the price should go up, and less of it due to employment growth. But our employment growth forecast is a little higher than we had in the past due to that higher participation rate.
Participation rate higher because of different segments, for example, older workers staying in the workforce longer? Is that what's responsible?
I don't know the answer to that. So I don't know the changes in the participation rate by age cohort, so I don't know.
I'm sorry, we want to add something to the question about the tight labor force. And I'm one of those older workers staying in the workforce for a while. So in terms of the tight labor market, there are a couple of issues I wanted to mention. And number one is the commitment, and this goes back to the question about how do we spend money or where do we spend resources this year, and that is in the area of education and training. Minnesota has a tradition, a history, and of having a talented and educated workforce. We're going to need that talented, educated workforce now more than ever. So as we move forward, we really need to make sure that we're putting money in all education, but certainly in the higher education and training. And that's one of the reasons I think you saw the governor's a third of his bonding bill was allocated just to higher education to make sure that those institutions have the money they need to maintain their facilities. But we need to make sure that we are doing whatever we can to ensure the success of students and workers in Minnesota to fill the jobs that we now know are out there and that are vacant. And the other thing, too, is from the point of view of the Minnesota State workforce, we negotiated a contract last summer after our budget bills were passed, and I think I've tried to make it clear to the legislature that we approved on those contracts. I signed off on the contracts based on our ability to fund those through our appropriations from last year. We think those are modest increases, a 2 and a 2.25% increase. In the private sector, you're seeing things much more in the 3% or more range. So we're hopeful that those labor contracts can be approved by the legislature. There's no cost to those. We've already implemented those through the budgets that we received last year. Any other questions?
Commissioner, can you tell me what the number is for debt service that you have with the new numbers on the budget, and what percentage is that based on?
The overall debt service? The overall debt service is, I don't have the exact number, it's a little over $1 billion per biennium for this biennium, then it grows a little bit into the next biennium. So what we're seeing now is that we're recommending, or we assume for the forecast that we have an $800 million bonding bill for this particular forecast, and that is paid for through the forecast. So if we do anything above $800 million, then we would have to add a little bit more. If we actually funded the governor's proposed $1.5 billion, it would be something between $10 and $20 million. We don't have the exact number yet, but that would add to the $1 billion biennial debt service that we have on an ongoing basis.
Cheap now?
Well, you know, last October, we had bond prices. We sold over $800 million in bonds, anywhere from 1.7% to 2.5%, I think was the range, and that's pretty good rates. You know, the rates are still fairly low now, but they're starting to move up. So we think, once again, this is a good time to bond because we have a good credit rating and we have an opportunity to get money that's relatively inexpensive. And really, for the long haul, it's the best way we can really enhance our asset preservation technique.
How big?
1.5 is a good number, $1.5 billion.
Can support it?
Yes, this can support it. I mean, as I said, it's about $10 to $15 million more this biennium and less than $100 million in the next biennium. But, you know, as I say, those are scarce resources, so everything needs to be weighed against other issues too.
Back to the tightening labor market, and previous forecasts had started to talk about concerns about household formations being down. Is that helping at all by the tight labor market? Are people getting better paying jobs earlier? Because it seemed as if young people were not forming households before, and that was a drag.
That's a question for Dr. Kalambokidis. Thank you.
So the question's about household formations, which means when the economy improves, people who have been living together during tough economic times separate. So the college graduates move out of the parents' basement. People who've took on a roommate during the recession, they move out, and so we get more households, and we use that in our forecast for housing demand and for our forecast for construction employment. So the Great Recession ended with disappointing levels of household formations. They did not pick up as quickly as pretty much anybody expected. There's the actual data we have on household formation still remains low, but we are forecasting that they improve in the next year and get within a couple of years up to what we think is a normal level. So there's this there've been these pent up formations that we are finally putting into the forecast.
Why do you think that is still low?
Why is that
concerning?
I don't know exactly why the numbers are low in the most recent data. They were surprisingly low, but there are a couple of things that it could be, and this is speculation. I mean, it could be that because the population is aging, we have more people moving into cohorts that are older, and older cohorts tend not to move as much and tend not to create households as much. And so it could be a demographic thing that way. And there's also speculation that it has some things to do with the living choices or living arrangements choices of the younger generation, the generation 25 to 35, who would be the ones who would buy new houses, that they they've changed their, or they have different preferences for housing relative to prior generations, possibly due to the time in the business cycle that they entered the job market. They're a little more spooked about taking those risks.
I know that had been part of the speculation, that we have a generation riddled with college debt, and that's formations.
Again, I would say that's speculation, that's potentially part of the story too for the lack of demand of younger people, but I don't have specific evidence saying that. It's just these are the things that are likely to be causing it.
What about the fact that there's a housing shortage and houses are more expensive, which is in this report?
Sure, but the disappointingly low household formations preceded that, and so those explanations, I think, precede that story. And so indeed, we have low inventory of houses for sale in the Twin Cities, and tight supply should increase prices, and indeed prices are getting higher, and so that becomes an issue of affordability.
How do you reconcile the rising price of housing with slow household formation?
Yeah, I think it's a puzzle. I think housing right now is a bit of a puzzle. So the rising prices would mean that affordability is lower, and so people might stay together longer. But what I think is the bigger puzzle is, why do we have tight supply, low numbers of houses on the market as the prices are going up? And
we're happy to answer more questions later, but the governor's en route, so.
Let me just clarify one question. I like to answer these things in real time. So the question about the amount of money that would come into Minnesota if we did full federal conformity, this is from a preliminary estimate revised from February 16th by the Department of Revenue. It's about $460 million additional revenue in 2019. And over $1 billion in 2021 would come in if we did full conformity without making any changes at all to Minnesota tax law from a policy standpoint.
We're going to take a short break here, and then the governor will be right here. Thanks,
Thank you all very much. Discuss. We also now know that the CHIP has been funded for 10 years at the federal level, and we now have the legislative funding bill signed by the governor as of Monday. All of these previous uncertainties are now reflected in this forecast, and in addition, we have included our projections of future economic growth. The budget forecast reveals the $188 million deficit from November has been replaced with a $329 million surplus. You can see that the revenues are growing by $353 million and expenditures are decreasing by $167 million. Now that's a net decrease, and Budget Director Kelly will describe that in more detail. The expenditures for fiscal year 2018-2019 now include the bill signed, as I said, on Monday by the governor for the legislative funding for this biennium. The total change, as you can see from the November forecast, is $518 million, or a $500 million improvement from what we saw in November. So I will now bring up Dr. Kalambokidis to explain the economic forecast.
Thank you, Commissioner. So I will start by talking a bit about the outlook for the U.S. economy and how that outlook has changed since we last prepared a forecast in November. I will then move to Minnesota's economy and finally the changes in our revenue forecast. So the first chart compares the current U.S. real GDP forecast by Minnesota's macroeconomic consulting firm, IHS, to their prior forecast. So the dark bars show IHS's February 2018 outlook, the one that informs our forecast today, and the light bars show their November 17 outlook. The chart shows that the outlook for U.S. economic growth has improved since the November forecast. The U.S. economic data coming in this winter has been solid. Consumer spending and business equipment investment have been strong, and consistent growth in other major economies has strengthened demand for U.S. exports. In addition, to the improvements in initial conditions. In addition, earlier this year, IHS incorporated into their baseline outlook stimulus from the Federal Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the TCJA. That was not in their November forecast. So that is a change from the November forecast to now. The addition of the TCJA has modestly improved the near-term U.S. outlook, U.S. economic outlook.
Classic, where the host turns to the speaker and says, should we let our guests enjoy themselves a while longer, or would you like to begin your remarks now? Today's budget forecast is good news for Minnesota. It projects budget surpluses for both the current biennium, fiscal years 2018-19, and the next biennium, fiscal years 2021. However, those projected surpluses are modest. $329 million in this biennium and $251 million in the next. And they are only projections, which are certain to change, especially for the 2021 biennium. They should caution all of us that any changes to current tax laws and expenditure commitments need to have minimal net effects, particularly since any ongoing changes would double their fiscal impact in the next two-year biennium compared to the one remaining year of the current biennium. Further caution is required because the state's macroeconomic consultant, IHS Market, predicts that after the temporary boost to the national economy provided by the federal government's massive tax cut and spending increase, both real GDP growth and consumer spending will recede to below their previous forecast for 20 and 21. Our Department of Revenue and Minnesota Management and Budget will spend the next several days refining their preliminary tax and spending estimates based on this new forecast. I will then use their revised estimates to prepare my own supplemental budget request, which I expect to issue on March 15th. Like the legislature, I will have to compress what I would like to do into what I believe we can do, given these limiting fiscal realities. Glad to respond to questions. And there being none.
So what would you like to do at this point? What are some of your priorities that maybe must go or must not go?
I want to decipher the numbers. You know, the Department of Revenue's career people have said this is the most complex federal tax bill in terms of its impact on Minnesota. They just got an update literally yesterday, day before yesterday, from the IRS, further clarification. So, you know, they need to do their, revise their estimates, MMB, accordingly based on the forecast. And I'm going to need to use that time to assess for myself what's possible to do, given all the things that, like everyone else, I'd like to do.
Surplus this small make the tax conformity and adjustment question more difficult, less difficult? But how does this affect, these numbers today affect that larger discussion about taxes?
Well, the talk has been about net revenue impact from, or zero revenue impact from the federal tax changes. So that, you know, means we're going to have to balance very carefully because, yes, there isn't much room there. And again, especially given whatever is done in this biennium, which has really one fiscal year remaining, will have double the impact if it's ongoing on the next biennium, the 2 years. And if you look at the national economic forecast prepared by the consultant, you know, they're projecting that both the real GDP and consumer spending are going to drop off in 2021. So, you know, not setting the stage for another fiscal cliff down the road has to be everybody's priority.
Will safety spending going to chew up some of this money?
Well, I wouldn't use those words, but it's a priority. I think it's been expressed by bipartisan, leaders in the legislature and myself. So, again, we're going to have to see what's possible. I'm not going to get into this much money for this or that. I'm not there yet. Got this morning, like all of you. And again, the numbers are going to be revised. And so, you know, it doesn't change everything I would like to do, as I've said already. But I don't have specifics in terms of what I think we can do.
Governor Dayton, the Republicans are going to present a much higher number, somewhere in the 460 million range today, and they're going to call these books cooked. Those are their words. What do you think?
I think that's extremely irresponsible. You know, the integrity of our this forecasting process is absolutely essential to the integrity of Minnesota government, and absent significant proof that they have, I think it's just extremely, extremely irresponsible, and it doesn't bode well for a constructive legislative session.
Has spoken. I think they're going to say we now have 463 million in the bank.
Well, that's a different charge. We have the surplus for this biennium, and then the next those add up to where did they get the 463? I don't know where that comes from. It's one thing that, you know, I mean, if we're going to go into another one of these, you know, Dayton's cooking the books again, it's going to be a very ugly legislative session. And to make that charge on a really incredibly sophisticated and highly separated from all the politics process that MMB uses, starting with a national economic consultant, and then having a group of outside economic advisors, and then going and doing their own process. I mean, the sophistication of that is unparalleled. The integrity of it is unquestionable. Well, should be unquestionable. And anybody who casts aspersions on the integrity of the process without proof positive is being extremely irresponsible.
Just along those lines, then, one of the things that Republicans cite is the repatriation numbers that are coming in for the money coming back into the United States. They suggest that it's lower than it really will be, $19 million as opposed to $160 million is what they suggest.
I mean, I have to know what the basis of their computation is. It's a somewhat speculative number, guaranteed, because nobody knows exactly how much is going to be repatriated. We could conform to the federal, which is they're going to assume it's all going to be repatriated and tax it they're cut at 8% immediately, and we allow 8 years to play that out. So I mean, part of it depends on how we respond to the federal change.
With the projected surplus as it is now, is there enough money there to do tax conformity, fix min-lars, make schools safer, and finance a bonding bill, all of those things? And among those things, what are the priorities given?
Well, I just said I'm not going to get into that, and I don't have the specifics on the dollars, and I don't going to have to reassess the priorities. Those are all important, but again, we have a very limited surplus here for this biennium, and even more so the next biennium. And we have to look. I'm going to have to look very carefully. The legislature can have to look very carefully at what's possible, what's fiscally responsible to do or not do, given the reality of the situation.
At the end of last session, you and others were concerned that the tax bill that you signed into law was too big and was going to cause problems down the road. Does this forecast ease those concerns?
Well, it depends on how people respond to it. I mean, I stand by that analysis, and I think the November forecast showed that we'd gone too far in both, you could say, both spending increases and revenue reductions. So, we got the good economic forecast, our continued economic recovery, and the boost provided by the federal stimulus means we're, they lifted ourselves out of the woods regarding this, but the same danger exists that we're going to stretch it too far this time, and these forecasts are not always going to come out better than previously projected. At some point, there's going to be an economic turn, and if we're already overextended, then the results of that will be even worse.
One of the priorities to make the projected surplus for 2020 and 2021 larger than it currently stands right now at $251 million for your successor?
I'll say it again. I don't have specific numbers. I have to look and see what the revised forecast is. I have to see. Because, I want a structural surplus, which is defined as a surplus in 2021. But that's got to be more than $1. So I'm just not prepared to say today.
Governor, you had breakfast, was it, with the leaders the other day? Did you talk about legislative priorities? Did you agree to anything?
We talked, in general sense about priorities, but nothing that was. We said we wait until this forecast doesn't really define what our options are.
You have another meeting set then?
We talked about another meeting and doing it another bipartisan. It was a productive meeting. If they're going to question the integrity of our administration, then that's not going to last. Then they'll have to buy their own McDonald's. What do they have? McMuffins, or what do they call it? What do they have now? I don't know. I don't eat them myself. Thank you.
You know, first, I think Governor Dayton left, but I think we all owe him a tremendous debt of gratitude as Minnesotans. You know, I spent a decade during the plenty years managing deficit after deficit after deficit, and then Governor Dayton got elected, and he immediately, in the 2011 session, faced a $6 billion deficit. We owed schools a couple $2 billion. We had $0 in the state's budget reserve. And this is his last forecast before the November election. So I think on behalf of all Minnesotans, want to offer my thanks that the governor has really turned the state around during his 8 years as governor. And fortunately, he's going to be able to hand off on election day at least, unless we stumble this session, he's going to be able to hand off a structurally balanced budget to the next governor. So Governor Dayton, congratulations. Thank you from all of us for your hard work. You know, the interesting thing about the forecast is there's been a lot of talk about the federal tax bill and what its implications on Minnesota is going to be. And I think one thing helpful for us to think about is if we do not do federal conformity, if we don't do it and we just stay with current Minnesota law, Minnesota is going to collect about an additional $500 million in new revenue over this biennium and the next. Isn't that interesting? That's about the number of the surplus for this biennium and the next. So really this surplus was made possible by the fact that that federal tax bill is going to raise enough revenue on Minnesotans to be able to get us a surplus, on paper at least. So it's the repatriation of the corporate earnings that are brought back, and I just want to remind everybody, 80% of that is brought back tax-free. We only tax 20% of that here in Minnesota. So to people who think that number's too low, just remember that 80% of it we're not going to subject to Minnesota taxes. In addition, you know, the federal government helped us out when they passed the CHIP funding. Had it not been for that, and I think if I remember right from the November forecast, that was about $180 million or something like that. That has helped, that money's now on the bottom line here in Minnesota. So the federal government has helped us out some with these numbers. And, you know, and I still remain very cautious that we don't overcommit this session. And as it relates to priorities, I can just tell you, I think on behalf of my caucus, one of the things that we think with this kind of razor-thin surplus that we have is we should honor the state's pension obligations. The Pension Commission met last night, and I believe the bill that they considered was a little north of $30 million in this biennium, but north of $120 million in the next biennium. So if you assume we're going to live up to our pension obligations, and if we don't, it's going to have an impact on the state's bond rating agencies. The next time we go out for a bond sale, I think it's fiscally prudent to resolve the budget shortfalls in our state pension system. But, you know, that takes of the 313 or so in the next biennium, that's north of 100 of it will be committed just by doing the pension bill by itself. So there's not room for a lot more. I will say I think the job for the leaders probably got a little easier today. You know, we've all got our days on the Hill, and today there's a number of days on the Hill thing, and usually when people come here, their days on the Hill thing, they want to advocate for more spending for what they're coming here to talk about. I think the fact that it's now pretty clear we have very little revenue will probably take a little bit of the excitement out of some of the people coming here looking for additional funding in the second year of the biennium. And and I spoke with a group kind of off the budget issue for just a second. I just had a group of young people here from the College of St. Scholastica. And this is a remarkable state, is what I told them, because if you look at one of those pages in that budget forecast, it speaks to the fact that there actually are more people, of a shortage of Minnesotans, more people more employers want more new employees than we have people available for work. Now, what that means, it's going to be very hard to stimulate an economy like that. It's very hard for businesses to hire new people if the people aren't available with the skill sets that they need. So I think providing additional stimulus is going to be very, very difficult in this economy. And I share some of the concern that The governor has about the next biennium. GDP growth has been downgraded slightly as a result of the federal tax bill into the next biennium. So continue to urge some caution, but certainly great news for Minnesota that we've got a structurally balanced budget, and we really owe it all to Governor Dayton's leadership.
Well, I think we're about to see a case where, just like in the area of climate change, Republicans like to deny the laws of physics and pretend it's not happening. With regard to the economic forecast, they seem to want to ignore fundamental economic principles. Economists from across the spectrum, from liberal to conservative, told President Trump and Republicans in Washington, D.C., that the net effect of a very large tax bill financed by deficit spending would be inflation in the out years that would put at risk economic growth. That is what we're seeing in the numbers today. We see a short-term stimulus, but over the long term, we will see inflation rise. And we can't ignore reality. We can not ignore economists, just like we can't ignore scientists. The numbers are clear. We have to be cautious with our budgeting. And so I think I agree with everything that Senator Bach said. The governor's approach to budgeting has been vindicated in this forecast in two respects. One, it's balanced, and that's as a result of a lot of work. And two, it looks out into the future, and it says what's in the best interest of Minnesota over the long term, and that we have to be cautious about what we do today over the long term. You know, and if we do have a situation where Republicans come to the microphone next and they impugn the integrity of nonpartisan economists who work for the state of Minnesota, it will bring us back too quickly to where we were in June, where we were arguing about illusory savings that they wanted to have in the Health and Human Services budget. Well, we just need to cut it 10% or 25%. And then you say, well, what exactly would you like to cut? Well, we don't know. It's just too high. It's growing too fast. So we have to be very clear and professional and responsible with the things that we do in the state budget. So we can't, just as we can't magically cut HHS without talking about how much less care will we provide to seniors or how many less seniors will we serve, we can't say we don't believe in economic forecast that's been put together by professionals and that we're going to ignore it and budget as though this is not the actual truthful information.
Senator Bach, is any amount of conformity possible? You've done a few tax bills in your day. Can anything be done?
Well, this made it more difficult. You know, the conformity bill, the current estimate we have from the Department of Revenue is it's going to raise taxes in Minnesota by about $459 million. That's about the same number of doing nothing. And the challenge, if you're going to raise that revenue, is how do you then find the mechanism to give it back so that you don't create winners and losers? And I think we probably all bipartisanly agree we should minimize the impacts of conformity on Minnesotans' tax liability. You normally have to be able to plug some additional money in to what you raise in order to buy out the losers in it. So finding that sweet spot where we can do that got more difficult because we have a little less revenue now to work with in addition to what we raise in the bill. But it can be done, but it's going to be incredibly complex.
I would just add, and my work is almost exclusively in tax policy, that we really need to know who is harmed by the federal tax bill among Minnesota taxpayers. Clearly, corporations and the business community are benefited by the federal tax bill, and we need to look at the individual taxpayer, particularly those families in the middle and lower middle income, as the focus that you're going to see, I think, from a number of proposals coming from the Senate tax Democrats. So I think we need to just keep that in mind when we are trying to get to some sort of neutrality with money raised and money reinvested in Minnesotans, to look who was harmed. And I think it's pretty clear that we're going to see evidence of that with lower middle income and middle income larger families. And we need to be really careful that they survive and thrive. And we are going to concentrate on that to the extent that we do conformity. And I share with Senator Bach caution not only on the revenue, but on the complexity of the policy. And acting too quickly is foolhardy. And we are not going to do that. We're going to take our time. We'll work with the Republicans. We'll work with the governor to make sure that when we do conformity, we don't have that we do it with a mentality of measure twice and only cut once.
Is 3 months enough to do this?
All depends. Being able to work together and having good information.
Is a $1.5 billion bonding bill supportable here, given all the other tightness and the other demands for resources?
That question was asked earlier of the Commissioner of MMB, and he indicated that there's an $800 million bonding bill paid for in the forecast, and going to 1.5 would increase debt service in the current biennium by about $20 million. So I think it's achievable.
Representative Carlson, go ahead. Do you have anything to add?
Well, I was just going to confirm what was said earlier. You know, we are leaving the state in very good shape as we move forward for the balance of this biennium. We are structurally balanced. That's the important thing. That's the message that I would hope that comes out of the press conferences here today. We do have some issues that we are going to need to address this session, and I think the resources probably are going to be there, but the bonding bill, as Senator Bach just pointed out, actually that was my question this morning, the difference between what is already forecast at $800 million and $1.5 billion. The debt service would be about $20 million. Next biennium, it does jump to about $100 million, but I think those numbers are manageable as we move forward with a vigorous bonding bill. The thing I want to mention about the bonding bill being a priority this year is that interest rates still remain relatively low, and I don't think that's going to be in the future. We know that interest rates, in fact, are going to be going up when you listen to what is coming out of the federal government, and I think we should take advantage then of the lower interest rates as well. One thing that I wanted to comment on, because some of you know that I've had quite a background in education here through the years, and one thing that I hope we can take a good look at is how we match, and this is primarily our two-year institutions, but the job training with the demand in certain fields. The employers are, as was pointed out, looking for employees in certain trades and professions. And one of the things that happens is that with our tech colleges, and I'll use those as an example, you downturn in the economy, they begin to close programs. And then the upturn comes and we're not prepared to meet the demand for workers. And so I hope that the Minnesota State, or what I still call the MNSCU system, will be able to respond quickly in that regard, because that will help those construction projects that would be in the bonding bill, and it would help create better employment opportunities for any number of people. We do have the pension issue. That was mentioned. That's an important one. It's an issue that I worked on when we were in the majority, and I chaired Ways and Means with Duluth. And what became a powerful message was that how expensive those pension fixes become if you don't deal with them up front. And when we got the projections from the Duluth plan, it just showed that each biennium, it just got very, very expensive. So I hope that we're able to address that up front and early, so that we save taxpayer dollars, if you will, and protect those plans on into the future. And then there's the MNLARS question, and that really comes due tomorrow. So I'm not sure just how that's going to be handled, but potentially that could be another relatively important issue that we need to address this session, just to mention a few. Thank you.
Just one last thing. I mean, when we're here this time next year, we're going to have a new House, and we're going to have a new governor, and I think we all need to respect that. We're going to have the same Senate. We don't know exactly what the makeup will be, but the same Senate. And the fact that we have $313 million in the next biennium available to spend, and we're going to spend some of that. We're going to spend some of the 329 in this biennium. We're going to spend some of the 313 in the next one. But the important footnote in the forecast is inflation in the next biennium is about 1.2 billion. Now, you can argue that, well, it's not 1.2, okay, but it's not zero either. So somewhere between the 1.224 in the forecast and zero is a number that is going to be inflation in the next budget that the next legislature and the next governor are going to have to deal with. It's just not zero. So I think we all need, as we make decisions going forward, whether it's the pension bill or MNLARS or whatever things that we think we have to do, we all need to be cognizant of that fact that, you know, in 2002, we took inflation out of the forecast so that we could kind of arbitrarily hide the spending side. But it is in there as a footnote. We all need to, we don't count it, but we all, those of us that are planning on being here next year need to be pretty conscious of it because it's real.
The largest turnarounds in a state revenue forecast in modern history. And the difference, what happened? We did tax relief here at the state level, and the federal government did tax relief at the federal level. So Republicans put more money back in Minnesotans' pockets, and the state has benefited from that. So it's a win-win. You know, I actually believe this forecast to be somewhat pessimistic. I think it could be even more optimistic based on the kind of growth that we're seeing. I wish that it was, but what great news that we've had this turnaround, and we're just thrilled with that. So I'll let the others speak, and then we can take some questions.
So today you're going to hear it in stereo from the House and the Senate. The Speaker and I really didn't talk before coming here, but the number one thing I want people to think about is that tax cuts are working. And I really don't care whether you think they're from the federal government or the state house. The fact is we did them in both places, and they are actually having an impact. And it is over a $600 million swing. You think about that. From the November forecast to now, it's over a $600 million swing to the good or to the positive, and that's really, really, really good news. We would have liked it to have been more. You could perhaps come to different conclusions. That's the thing about a forecast, is you don't always know everything that's going to happen. It's a forecast. November's forecast turned out to be not as true as some thought it was going to be. And so, you know, in the end, we might actually have more there, and we just don't know it yet. But it's still really, really good news that we have that kind of a swing. So the Senate Republicans announced their agenda. We're going to continue with that agenda. There may be things that we have to adjust, but that agenda is the same. And with that, we'll take some questions.
Harder going forward.
This is the easiest job in Minnesota, 34-33. No, you know, because we're focusing on the things that I think matter for Minnesota, there was a number of questions about what are we going to do about tax conformity. And the fact is we have to do that. We have to conform. And if we just conform, as you've heard, on average, it creates about $500 million a year. That's money that we will use when we're working through conformity. What are some of the other things that we need to do to make sure people don't have a tax increase? So that we're still going to work on that no matter what the number was. We have to do that. Minlars or the DMV debacle, we have to fix it. We have to find a way to get through that. We're not giving up on that one. Safe schools is still super important. How do we fund it? There were a number of ways that we could have done it before. Now there are less ways, but it's still very, very important. So, and the rest of the agenda, it's something I think Minnesota wants us to do, and we will do it.
Senator, do you expect to use any of this surplus to apply it to the tax reform equation so that you can even further minimize the tax impact on Minnesotans?
Yeah, as you heard me in November say, I think we have $1 billion surplus. Well, that's not the number, but if you go out to years 20 and 21, there's $1 billion shift to the good, so maybe I was sort of right. But no, I mean, I think if we'd had that extra money, we could have done more conformity to some of the other things we didn't do in the past. We had some bold ideas. The House had some bold ideas that are less likely because of where we're at today, but that still is a high priority that we have to get done for Minnesota.
The governor said that these numbers should caution all of us that any tax law changes need to have minimal net effects. Is that your philosophy heading into this too?
Well, in the end, as I mentioned, when we first just conform, that creates roughly $400 to $500 million a year of revenue that would come into Minnesota if we do nothing. So that's money that I think you heard Senator Bach as well talk about. That shouldn't come back to Minnesota. So that's where we have room to work on this. We want to be responsible anyway. We're concerned about not spending too much and doing that anyway, but this makes it much more important that we not make mistakes.
Should all of this be used for tax cuts and spending, or should you save some of this?
I think I'm going to jump back over to this question if I can. I appreciate the governor's prudence in not wanting to reduce taxes. He's been very consistent on that his entire career. But the reality is the governor was wrong. We reduced taxes on Minnesotans. We left more money, $600 million more in Minnesotans' pockets, and the state actually sees more revenue come in. This is a great lesson for all of us in how our economy can benefit taxpayers and the state government. I'm thrilled with the fact that we were actually able to invest money back into Minnesotans. They can improve their families and their small businesses and their child's education and whatever, and we will still see more revenue because we've grown the economy, and I think that's a win-win for everybody. And I'm really thrilled today to see the fruits of that labor. To the governor's prudence. If we should see, almost no net effect in tax policy, I would expect the same prudence on the governor's spending. If we're in that situation, and he believes we're in that situation, the same rules apply to spending. So we'll see if he feels the same way when he puts out his supplemental budget request. What was your question over here, Don?
Should you put all this surplus to tax cuts and spending, or should you save some?
I don't know. I think we'll probably take a measured approach, and I'll give you the same answer that the governor did. I think we're going to want to kind of analyze this and see what it means. I think, as I just said, we're proud of the fact that our philosophy is working out, that we were able to invest some money back into Minnesota families, and ultimately that paid a dividend to the state. So we would like to continue that. I think that philosophy isn't going to be a surprise to anyone. I think investing in Minnesota families was the right thing to do in the last budget, and we're seeing the fruit of that payoff now for the state. So would we like to continue that? Yes, but I think we want to take a measured approach and make sure we understand the ramifications of all of what we do this session.
Are you going to use this number?
Would you like to see more optimistic? You made a comment about this could be more optimistic.
And I want to say, I appreciate the work that we think. I have a feeling that Senator Gazelka was being a little tongue-in-cheek when he said he has the easiest job with a Senate that's 34-33, but I'll tell you who has the toughest job is the people who have to predict our budget forecast. Can you imagine? I mean, you think your job is tough. They have to try to, foresee into the future all these different economic impacts and try to gauge what's going to happen and predict a number that we then can use with enough confidence that we're going to actually pass bills that could spend that money that hasn't come in yet, right? I mean, that's an incredibly difficult job, and they do that job incredibly well. I believe that they justify their number with assumptions that they believe that I believe are very conservative. I think those are pessimistic assumptions, and while they do their work incredibly well, I believe they've been pessimistic. We said that they were being pessimistic in the November forecast. We've seen now a $500 or $600 million turnaround. I mean, if you look at the numbers, just in where we are to date, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, we had a $188 million deficit. Add to that the CHIP money, we received $225 million from the feds, subtract out the legislative funding of $134, and then I think we've taken in November, December, and January $560 million of revenue above what was forecast, okay? To date, right now, we are already $463 million ahead. But their assumptions, and I respect the fact that they have made these assumptions. I tend to think they're being too pessimistic, but their assumptions are so pessimistic that we can't even count the money that we already have in the bank, right? So they're being pretty pessimistic moving forward, right? If we're 463 now, and over the next 16 months, they think we're gonna net out at 329, that's pessimism. And that's what I mean when I say I think they're being overly pessimistic. But there have been a lot of changes, and I think they're being cautious. Do I think they could have been more optimistic? Absolutely. But what a great thing that even as pessimistic as I think they probably could have been, we still have a $600 million turnaround from the November forecast. So things are great, even when you put it through what I think is a fairly pessimistic lens, and I think Senator Rosen wants to talk, right? Or who? Somebody does. I knew somebody did. Sorry.
Well, two things I'd say quick. First of all, Don, to your question, you remember this premium subsidy program that we passed last year that I've heard estimates of there was going to be a surplus of anywhere from $50 to $100 million on that when it's all said and done. That goes back into the budget reserve, whatever that surplus finally ends up being at the end of this year. So for those thinking we should have some more money in the budget reserve, there is, absent any law change, some additional money, amount unknown, but at least some tens of millions of dollars that are going to go back into it. You know, married to this issue of you know, the forecast accuracy and all that, you know, we've had I talked to Bill Marks before I came here, we've had $568 million more in revenues in the last 3 months than we expected. And, you know, we've got 17 more months of revenue to go before the end of the biennium. I think the number or the day you should all watch for is March 10th. I mean, what you're really seeing in this forecast with this projection is the state economist is saying that revenues are really going to crash on March 10th for February. They're predicting that a whole lot of people paid a whole lot of taxes early, and that's why you had so much more pile up in the last 3 months, and it's going to come home to roost on March 10th when you see what people paid in February. And you know, in 10 days, we'll have to see. You know, if it meets projections, maybe we ought to come out with a bill that takes some extra money that might pile up and put it into roads and bridges or something like that.
Speaking of numbers, Senator Gazelka, 1 week ago you predicted $1 billion surplus. What happened to that?
I think I meant the years 20 and 21 when it switched to billion. No, I don't. And I know Senator Rosen wants to make some comments. A couple things I looked at in the projections where I thought it was a bit pessimistic is I was wondering why, for example, the GDP was listed at, for 2017, 2.3%, and I still don't have a great answer. Second quarter was 3.1, third quarter was 3.3, fourth quarter was 2.7, so how do you get to that number? And it's just poking holes to ask questions. And another one was on page 34 of the report. They showed in the November forecast that our corporate profits were 5.5%. Now they're projecting them at 1.5%. And I said, well, why? Well, that was what, they didn't have a good answer. And so it's stuff like that where we say maybe it's a little more pessimistic, but these are the numbers we're going to work with. It's still good news, and that's my story. But I know Senator Rosen had some comments.
Well, I think we have beat this over very well as far as the numbers, and I think we should all take a victory dance. There's probably some betting boards out there that there's some big losers because we did think that this forecast was going to come in higher. But the point is it's about $600 million over what we projected. So it is actually really good news. And I think we should all, and the governor and our members across the aisle should pat ourselves on the back and say, you know what, we did pretty good with state government last year. We set the tone very well, but we have some other state responsibilities going forward. So I want to redirect this conversation to those other state responsibilities that we have to do. And it is about reform. It's looking at how we're delivering state government. At this junction right now, HHS budget will increase by 13% in the next biennium, $1.8 billion. So we need to start looking how we deliver government better and more efficiently. Like I said, we have some other state responsibilities. For me, it's pensions. It was mentioned earlier, and it's school safety. It's a lot of issues that we have. So I personally would like to leave some on the bottom line, too. I think that's a very prudent way, and obviously my colleagues and the governor feel the same way. So I look forward to working with the governor on this. I look forward to having Commissioner Frans coming to my committee tomorrow morning, the Finance Committee, and we're going to be looking at those numbers very closely.
Senator Bach said that this number makes tax conformity more difficult. Do you agree with that?
Well, more is always better, of course. And aside from that, we are going, as the majority leader and the speaker have said, we are in a better position than we were a few months ago. We believe that we will be in a much better position in the months ahead, and we are going to work with the numbers we have. We believe that the forecast was a bit pessimistic. Numbers we have, we're going to work with it. We're going to deliver the relief.
Speaker and Majority Leader, are you going to take action this week to approve $10 million for the MNLARS fix?
I don't know. We're going to have some conversations. I think we even might have some meetings set up this afternoon with some of the commissioners to talk pretty in depth about what has gone on with the MNLARS system. There have been some incredible lapses in judgment. Promises were made that have been not kept, and we want to know, first of all, what happened, but we need to know what happened so we can make sure that that doesn't happen again. This is the second big computer system rewrite rollout of this administration that has just been an absolute disaster. MNsure being the first one and MNLARS now. And the people that are impacted by this, when you think of the fact that we've spent, I think, $93 million or something already on this system, and now because it's not working as promised, it was supposed to be working right now based on the money we already spent and the investment we already made, it's not working. They want another $43 million. It's not like, well, we need 10% more to fix it. They're asking for 50% more to fix it right now, and I'm hearing that they're going to ask for another 30-some million each of the next 2 years. So that's literally, more than 200% increase in what this thing is costing, and there's still no promise and guarantee that we'll have a system that works at the end. So I think we all together need to sit down and figure out what the best path forward is, and we really need all the answers. We need to know what happened, when it happened, how these decisions were made, and we can't just move forward. We have to look at where the lapse in judgment was and how we got to this point. If we don't, there's no certainty that those same problems won't plague the plan to move forward. And without that level of confidence, I don't know that the current legislature is going to want to make investments like that. We need answers and we need assurance that there is a path out of here and that it can work.
Mr. Speaker, should the...
Just wait.
Let me just speak for the Senate as well. We're committed to getting it fixed. It may be not our fault, but it's a problem that we all need to fix. And the frustration is that we just got a notice roughly a week ago saying if we don't have the money by March 1st, 10 million, we're going to send off layoff notices. And if anybody knows how long it takes to pass a bill and run through committee, that's an incredibly difficult ask. And so even at our breakfast, we circled back to the governor. All of us were talking about this issue. We know it's important. Even the governor's exploring, is this the right rabbit hole to go down, or is there a different direction that we need to go? And so, but in the end, our commitment is that we will get it fixed. So, and one other thing I meant to mention on something else, because I think we're in good shape as far as our budget and where we're at. But nobody mentioned that between our budget reserves and cash flow account, we have almost $2 billion in reserves. So, in addition to the fact that we have this surplus, we have money that we've set aside that is at very good levels as well.
About bonding specifically, question about bonding specifically for both the leaders, or all the leaders. The MMB says a $1.5 billion bonding bill is supportable. So does Senator Bach, and you need his votes over in your chamber, Mr. Leader. That's a bonding bill. What do you think?
So $1.5 billion is possible according to the governor, but I don't think it's wise. And the formula that we've been going off would show that it should be around $800 million. That's something that I've expressed an openness to. The fact that both the Speaker and I are talking about an infrastructure bill tells you that we think it's important. But I think $1.5 billion is too high from my vantage point.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't see that sort of number. I think you could have made that argument if we had $1 billion surplus today. But I have listened to my colleague Senator Bach for the last month or so as we've been on the circuit on these panels say that in the last biennium we spent too much money. Now what he's talking about includes tax relief, because in St. Paul we count sending money back to Minnesotans as spending in a weird twist of fate. But the reality is at a time when everybody's kind of recommending, hey, let's use a little prudence as we move forward, doubling down on incurring more debt service is probably not the most prudent avenue. If we do $800 million, that is the debt service level that is supported in this particular forecast. If we do any more than that, it will take additional spending on debt service to pay for that. Is $1.5 billion supported by this? It could be. That's $700 million for $20 million in debt service. We have about $329 million that we could spend on debt service, so I don't know how many billions of dollars of bonding we could support if we wanted to, but nobody thinks that that's going to happen. So in reality, an $800 million bonding bill is what's supported by this forecast. It also would put us in a weird coincidence directly at our 10-year average for the last bienniums. So I would look for a number closer to that.
And if I can jump in on that really quickly, we heard something about pensions. That pension bill that was talked about last night has $132 million of cost in the out biennium. You heard them say that bonding bill, if we do the governor's, is over $100 million of additional cost in the next biennium. You do just those two, there's virtually no money left in the next biennium, and certainly there are going to be other things that come up that people are going to want to have some tails on for something in the next biennium. So again, just with the math, I don't see how that's supportable.
Chairman in your committee this week.
We did.
Telling you the economy is really in rough shape in Minnesota. Does that give you pause about these upcoming years?
Well, I wouldn't say that they said the economy was in rough shape so much as they said that the business climate, the tax climate, various policies that we've implemented as a state are causing headwinds for us, that we've got people leaving the state, that we've got people that are relatively high-income people leaving the state, and that those things are causing us to have more problems here in terms of money coming in and such than was expected. In fact, one of the things we heard from the state economists today is the reason that they're not projecting as much money for the individual income tax as we thought is that there's less non-wage income coming in than they expected. Well, I guess that's either one of two reasons. A, it's those people delaying things in terms of making their payments, or it's exactly what's being talked about, that wealthier people are fleeing the state, and so there is less non-wage income, capital gains, and so forth. So I do think that's a real concern, yes.
Can I answer that as well? Just a couple thoughts. My thought on the bonding bill is I may be a little different than my colleagues. I think $800 million is a lot. I think that we need to exercise caution, and so we'll have more discussions about, 1.5 is out of the question, I think, but we'll have more talks on that. And regarding your question on the Minnesota economy, I think one of the takeaways from the presentation was the actual strength of the Minnesota economy. Income's up, wealth is up, and unemployment is at a 17-year low. So we are at a very good spot in Minnesota, and this puts us in a very good position to meet the priorities we've set forth. And it just really shows, as the leaders have said in the beginning, that the tax cuts that we put forward and that they put forward at the federal level is not only affecting us in the country, but it's really having a positive impact in the economy in Minnesota. So I think there was a lot of positive information in the report, and I think we're in really good shape.
Earlier, are you going to be looking at the surplus to fund those, or what other revenue sources might you consider?
Well, for sure, one that comes to mind that would be different than what Senator Nelson talked about was the safe and secure school levies. That's something that we can adjust, and so I just want to be open to what are the things we can do to actually get to that problem. And so I'm going to let the chairs of education lead, but we certainly have more than one avenue to explore.
Said that he would like to see more heads roll at MNLARS. How will that actually work? Would there be like a roster submitted to the committee that's passing the bill, or how's
the
that?
Same guy that said it's not a rabbit hole, it's a gopher hole because it's Minnesota. But you know, Senator Newman is very passionate about this issue because he's been working at it for quite a few months and didn't feel like he got accurate information early. And so that's why he's taking the hard stance that he is now. And it's those early conversations where he didn't get all the data that now make it difficult now to move forward as fast as we want to. So stay tuned.
Do you think that the governor should find the $10 million that he's asking for now out of state agency budgets, trim it as Representative Torkelson is suggesting now?
Well, certainly if the governor found the $10 million, I would shake his hand and let's do it. But I don't know that he will be able to do that, but that would be a way to get to it right away.
Mr. Speaker, what do you think about Chair Torkelson's suggestion that that's where
you know, the sentiment is right. Somebody made a decision that this system was ready for prime time. Somebody made a decision on how to develop this system, and at some point they made a decision to say, go, we're going to flip over to this new system. Whoever made those decisions in the private sector would be held accountable. They would have signed a contract and they would have been held to the contractual agreement that would have bound them to the work they had promised. Minnesotans have not received the product that they were promised for the investment that they have made. And I think it's only right that, you know, somebody in the administration be held accountable for their error. And if it was the private sector, that company would have to live up to their obligation and make this thing right and make it work. And unfortunately in government, nobody is held accountable. And we just think it's fair that if the governor says he's responsible, and he has said that to us, he said it publicly that he's responsible for this, if he is, then take some responsibility. Show us how you can fix it. Make some sacrifice to find a way to fix this thing. It's too easy to go back to the taxpayers, and I think the taxpayers are concerned, and I've been getting so many emails on this issue. You must have all been doing a lot of stories on this lately, but I've been getting so many emails from people saying, whoever screwed this up, don't give them more money, and you know, hold them accountable for what the promises that they made, and make them fix it for the resources you already gave them. In the real world, that's the way it should work. Will it work that way? I'm not sure. But in order for it to work differently than that, we're going to have to start getting some more candid answers from the administration on where the lapses were. And we're hopefully going to have very respectful conversations and productive conversations within the next couple of days to try to get to that end. And I'm hoping to facilitate those myself. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.